there we go. Also, parents without Social Security numbers can create an FSA ID, which was different in years past. There is an actual process that I'll talk about for parents who do not have Social Security numbers to get an FSA ID. We know currently there's a problem with parents who do not have a Social Security number. They're having difficulty creating an FSA ID. Recent guidance from federal student aid is saying that these parents are not able to create one right now. They have to work through some challenges on the back end, but that is one of the changes that are coming with this application, that these parents will be able to create an FSA ID to move through the application. Also, students and contributors are required to provide consent to have their 1040 form information imported from the IRS through the DDX process. Students can list up to 20 colleges and universities at one time, which we saw from moving through the application. The student aid index is now replacing the EFC, and I'll talk about just kind of what that really means in practice. And then the FAFSA submission summary is replacing the SAR, or the student aid report, that we are used to students receiving after they have submitted their FAFSA and it's been processed. Changes that are specific to the student financial section that we should have awareness of. Untaxed income is no longer reported, so families don't have to report SSI, SSDI. Untaxed income is no longer reported. Asset information is no longer reported for families whose income is higher than 60K, or they check yes to any of those simplified needs test questions that I showed during the demo or during the prototype review. Next, child support will be reported as an asset and not income, which I showed again during the demo. The number in college is no longer a consideration in FAFSA calculations. In years past, if a family had more than one student in college, they would kind of split up the EFC based on the number of folks in college. That is no longer a consideration in the FAFSA SAI calculation. Also, reporting of net value of all family farms and businesses is required, but just be mindful, market value minus debt owed on that particular property or that particular business, that particular farm, is the net value. So be sure that families are using the appropriate numbers when reporting that information. All right, changes with the FSA ID or the studentaid.gov account. Just to be mindful, they're the same. I've gotten emails from folks saying, this family created a studentaid.gov account, but they didn't create an FSA ID. They're the same thing. We just use them both interchangeably. But if they've created a studentaid.gov account, the username and password is the FSA ID. New this year, everyone creating an FSA ID, even if you already have one, must use the multi-factor authentication process. And so it has to be done via email, mobile, or the Authenticator app. If you've already created an FSA ID, when you go to log in to the FAFSA, you're going to get a pop-up telling you that you have to choose another way to authenticate your identity in order to get into the application. So even if you've done one in the past, you have to go in. You will be required to do it when you log in with your FSA ID with the new FAFSA, the 2024-2025 FAFSA. FSA recommends that folks use the Authenticator app because they're not required to use any cell phone service or internet connection in order to verify that information. It just kind of gives them a series of numbers that they can input to satisfy that authentication process. Also, ID matching and verification of email will be required for every student aid account. This is why there is a delay this year and moving forward in creation of FSA ID. So there's a delay between creating the FSA ID and verifying it because there has to be an ID match and they have to go through the process through the Social Security Administration for their ID to be verified in order for them to be able to use the FSA ID. I'll show you in a minute what this process will look like for a family that does not have a Social Security number in just a second. But the last thing to note is that supposed to take up to 3 days for account authentication to happen. We know that there's some families who've waited a week or more. We've just told them to just keep checking over and over again. And if all else fails, use the paper FAFSA if they have to. But generally, it was anticipated that it will take up to 3 days for verification to happen. Some folks have gotten theirs in 3 days. Some have gotten theirs in a week and a half. So it really depends on the family, when they create the FSA ID, a lot of other factors that we don't have an awareness of, but we just keep encouraging them to log back in to see if it's been verified yet. And if we get to a point where the family is like, I'm tired, I'm not going to keep doing this, we encourage them to complete the paper FAFSA, because the goal is FAFSA completion, whether it be online or the paper version. We just want them to be able to get the application done. All right, for non-US citizens, they have created a process for them to be able to access an FSA ID or create an FSA ID. So this is kind of a flow chart that explains what that process will look like. Once they get on the FSA ID screen, we saw how parents who do not have an FSA ID can click the box and say they do not have a Social Security number. Well, then they will go to the knowledge-based verification process. What is that? Question generated by TransUnion, the credit bureau, based on the family, based on that particular person's kind of accounts that they have created here in the US. This does not require them to check their credit history, or no credit will be checked. They're just pulling information to be able to ask questions to verify this person's ID. If they're not able to pass the, well, I'll start first. If they are able to satisfy that verification process, then great. They have been verified, and then they will be matched by Social Security Administration to be able to use that FSA ID and move it forward. There have been a couple parents who've been able to move through that process pretty seamlessly with the knowledge-based verification questions. However, if their answers do not match what Federal Student Aid has pulled from TransUnion, they will have to go through the next step, which is ID proofing. If they can't go through the knowledge-based verification process, they'll get a pop-up notifying, letting them know that they should contact Federal Student Aid directly. And then with Federal Student Aid directly, they will have the opportunity to submit an attestation form, proof of identity, or utility bill and ID. The point of contact at Federal Student Aid will let them know what information they could provide them to satisfy their requirements. But the first step is contacting Federal Student Aid directly. We know that that has been cumbersome, that has been problematic. Families have not been able to get in touch with Federal Student Aid who've been calling. We know that there's a recording that says that one recording is that folks aren't available, call back at another date. A more recent recording has been directed towards folks who do not have Social Security numbers. They're letting them know that they can't create one right now, but if they hold out, Federal Student Aid is working through those glitches, and hopefully they'll have it handled soon. So we know right now, parents who do not have Social Security numbers are not able to create FSA IDs. But Federal Student Aid hopes to work through those challenges and give them that opportunity again as they move through those issues. At the end, and one of the things that I'm going to email you all after the workshop is a link to the FAFSA issues alert page. And it has a running list of all the issues with the Better FAFSA or 2024-2025 FAFSA. And it lets you know what issues have been resolved, what issues they're still working through. And I think it's a good place to find out, are we the only one having this problem, or is this a problem going on throughout the country? So I'll give you a link to that website. It's a way that you can monitor changes as well as updates and be able to better serve your families and students by being informed about where the glitches are and the awareness of those glitches. Other things to note about folks who do not have Social Security numbers creating an FSA ID: the contributor who creates an FSA ID without an Social Security number will have that section grayed out. We saw it during the demo. That section will be grayed out. So the family will not, that person will not be able to enter all zeros, and they will not be able to enter an I-10 number. Gotten a couple emails about that too. Why can't they enter an I-10? In the past, we have been given guidance around them being able to use an I-10 to create an FSA ID, but that is not the updated information. The updated information is that they have to have they have to have a social security number or not. They may not use an I-10 in that block to be able to get an FSA ID. They can only use an I-10 later on in the application so that federal student aid can connect to the IRS database. The I-10 is used for financial reasons. So they're using it in this space to be able to connect to the IRS database using the DBX platform. So consent, I've talked a lot about consent. It is a requirement this year to be eligible for federal student aid. Student and their contributors must provide consent, regardless of the tax status. So regardless if they filed income taxes or not, consent is required, regardless of their citizenship status. So even if they're not US citizens, even if they are foreign citizens in other spaces, they still must provide consent. And regardless of their method of FAFSA submission. So if they're doing the paper FAFSA, they still must provide consent for that information to be pulled from the IRS. And anything pulled from the IRS will override any information or financial information that's submitted on the FAFSA that may not match. So any information from the IRS will override it and be populated in the form instead. As we saw during the demo, there'll be many opportunities for contributors to decline consent. The student can decline consent, and other contributors can decline consent as well, and still complete the FAFSA. There's even an opportunity for students to manually input financial information from a W-2. They are not eligible for aid. They must provide consent in order to be eligible for federal student aid. So what are they providing consent and approval for? Well, they're agreeing to share their personally identifiable information provided by FAFSA, have their federal tax information transferred directly into the FAFSA, allow the U.S. Department of Education to use their federal tax information to determine eligibility for federal financial aid, allow the U.S. Department of Education to share their federal tax information with higher ed agencies and schools listed on the FAFSA. And then lastly, allow the U.S. Department of Education to reuse their federal tax information on other FAFSA forms that the contributor may be invited to participate, may be provided to participate in, and they must choose to participate in that application for the information to be transferred. So just because they provide consent and they receive an invitation, that information won't be exchanged unless the contributor agrees to participate on the form. And we saw during the demo how the parent has to either accept or decline the invitation to contribute to the FAFSA. Just as a reminder, I think it's important to kind of go through who qualifies based on dependency statuses for independent status or dependency override. Generally, students are considered independent if they are the age of 24 by January 1 of the award year, they are married, they are graduate students who are working on a master's or a doctorate degree. That means they already have a bachelor's degree. They are active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces or are a veteran. Since the age of 13, they have no living parent or were in foster care, or they're awarded the state, meaning they're in a legal guardianship with the state of Virginia. They could be an emancipated minor. They could be in a court-ordered legal guardianship with someone not a parent or a step-parent. They have children or dependents who receive more than half of their financial support from the student, or they're unaccompanied homeless youth who is homeless. Those students, all of these students who qualify for each one of these 9 categories are considered to be independent students. And in some cases, they may be dependent students but qualify for a dependency override. But this year, they want to make a point of defining what unusual and special circumstances were. In years past, students may qualify for what they call special circumstances, but it wasn't clearly defined. We knew that there are differences in how a student's circumstance could be perceived by a financial aid office at different schools, but I think it's great that federal student aid is taking the time to kind of define what these 2 categories are. We'll break them into 2 categories and then define what they are so we can know how to advise students that we're working with around this particular issue. So There are two categories that a student could qualify for. That could be a change in their SAI, so change in the federal aid that they may be eligible for, or a change in their dependency status. So let's start with unusual circumstance. A dependent student may indicate that they are unable to contact their parents due to desertion or issues of safety. And that means that they could qualify for a change in their dependency status. This student, a student who's checking those boxes, will get what's known as provisional independent status. And then they can follow up directly with the school's financial aid office to provide supporting documentation, and that financial aid office will determine if the student qualifies for a dependency override. I was deciding whether or not I was going to make another point about unusual circumstances, but I'll leave it as it stands. Special circumstances will mean that a dependent student may indicate that they have a special circumstances affecting the family income. The way that I have determined the difference is special. The first S in special stands for salary. So that's how we know it's a change in money, versus unusual, which could be a change in the dependency status. So with a special circumstance, a student will make that selection on the FAFSA application, and then the app will calculate what's known as a provisional SAI. Again, the student will follow up directly with with the financial aid office at their respective college or university where they've been offered admissions, providing information as necessary, and then the school's financial aid office will determine whether or not it warrants a change in the student's SAI based on the documents they are provided. There were a lot of questions in registration about contributors. What is a contributor? Who is a contributor? How do we determine what a contributor is? Well, a FAFSA contributor is someone who must provide their financial information on a student's FAFSA. The student themselves is considered a contributor because they are contributing information to the application. So when the student includes someone as a contributor outside of themselves, Federal Student Aid will send an email to the contributor. We saw during the prototype what the email looks like that parents receive. And the email will invite them to complete their section of the FAFSA. Just as a reminder, contributors do not have to wait for the email from FSA. Once the student has added them to the FAFSA, the parent can log right into the FSA website, go to complete the FAFSA form, and then they'll get a pop-up saying, your student has invited you or needs your help in completing a section of the FAFSA. But who are contributors? One, the more common contributor is a student. All students who are filling out the FAFSA must have an FSA ID, and they are considered to be contributors. Parents could be considered contributors, and or step parents if that parent in a single family situation, a single parent household, if the parent has provided more of the student's financial support, and that parent has gotten married, the step parent is a contributor as well. And then lastly, if the student is married, a student spouse is considered to be a contributor, but they only need to be listed separately if the filing status for the student is married filed separate. If they file married filed jointly, they don't necessarily need to invite their partner to complete a section of the FAFSA. Their information will suffice. So identifying who the contributor is, I mentioned earlier, it's the person who, in a single parent household, is the person who contributed more than half of the student's financial support. But here's a flow chart that is helpful in understanding it. So first is the student's parents married to each other? The answer is yes, great. Both have to report information. Now, it depends on their filing status if both have to create an FSA ID and if both have to be invited to be contributors, but both are contributors in one way or the other. If the answer is no, the next question is, do the student's parents live together? If the answer is yes, again, report both of those parents' information. And if there's a step parent living with the student, yep, you include that parent as well. But if the answer is no, the next question, as we saw from the prototype, asks which parent provides more financial support in the past 12 months. Once a student has identified that parent, if that parent has remarried or gotten married, then that parent and the step parent must provide information. If there's not a step parent involved, that parent is the contributor and will provide information, is required to provide information for the FAFSA. Just as a reminder, there are some folks who are not contributors. I know sometimes we could assume that some people are contributors because students may live with different people. But as a reminder, if the person has not legally adopted the student, they're not a biological parent, they are not considered to be contributors. That includes extended family, grandparents, widowed step-parents, siblings, neighbors, family, friends. They are not considered to be contributors. In those cases, federal student aid wants information from the non-custodial, the parent whichever parent is the student can access. That's who federal student aid wants the information from. Now, if for some reason the student may qualify for an unusual circumstance, which I mentioned earlier, that student can get a dependency override if for whatever reason they can't access their parent for desertion or for issues of safety. But these folks are not considered to be contributors. If a student is in a legal guardianship, so they could be in foster care or just in legal guardianship in the state, they're considered to be independent students. So they'll get a dependency override and they're not providing any parental information on the actual FAFSA. Another question that I got about 3 questions around the new FAFSA kind of calculations or eligibility for FAFSA. And so I don't know if I don't know if there've been necessarily changes in how financial aid officers or federal student aid approach the awarding for Pell Grants, but I do appreciate how it's a lot more transparent this year in how they're awarding the Pell Grant. And so Pell can be awarded in 3 different ways. The first is Max Pell. A student may qualify for the maximum amount of the Pell Grant this year is around $7,500. But they could be considered for the maximum amount of the Pell Grant based on family size, adjusted gross income, poverty guidelines, and tax filing status. A student qualifying for the maximum Pell Grant will also have an SAI between -1,500 and 0. I'll talk about SAI a little bit later in this particular session, but an SAI can go down to -1,500, whereas the EFC, the lowest EFC, you can get a 0. So those students who qualify from whose SAI is from -1,500 to 0, they qualify for the maximum Pell Grant. Next, they have calculated Pell Grant, which a student may qualify if their SAI is less than the maximum Pell Grant. So they can subtract the student's SAI from the maximum amount of the Pell Grant, so about $7,500, subtract the SAI, and that's what calculated Pell is. And then next is minimum Pell, which a student whose SAI may be greater than 7,500, they may still qualify for some Pell award based on other eligibility factors that's kind of built into the equation. Now, federal student aid and the financial aid offices at the schools can determine if a student can qualify for a minimal Pell Grant, even if their SAI is higher than the maximum Pell Grant being awarded that year. So 3 categories: max, calculated, and minimum. Minimum, I think, is a game changer for a lot of different folks because it considers them for the Pell Grant, whereas historically they may not have been considered just based on their EFC. This year, we've kind of taken the time to run some numbers to figure out what are the income levels for families who want to be considered for Pell eligibility. I'm often emailed asked what is the maximum income that a family can have to be eligible for the Pell Grant. So we ran some numbers this year to kind of give folks some insight into what that would look like. In front of you, you see numbers from a single parent family. So that's one parent along with dependents and just kind of their eligibility for Pell Grant. So I'm going to kind of choose one to show you how to read the chart. The first column where it says maximum Pell eligibility, that's the most money that family can make and still qualify for the maximum amount of Pell Grant. So in the first row, a family size of 2, so that's a parent and a student, the most income that family can make is $41,198 and still qualify for the $7,500 in Pell Grant. that family will still be Pell eligible as long as they make up to $59,508. But if they make $1 more than that, they are no longer eligible for the Pell Grant. So this is what the numbers will look like for a single parent family. This is what the numbers will look like for a two-parent family. So again, just to kind of walk through, let's look at a parent of 5. So there's 2 parents, 3 kids. The maximum income that this family can have and still qualify for the maximum amount of the Pell Grant is $65,083. They can make up to $102,273 and still be eligible for the Pell Grant. But if they make $1 more than that, they are no longer eligible for the Pell Grant. All right, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the SAI. This is the number that really informs how much federal financial aid a student is eligible for, and in some cases, how much state financial aid a student may be eligible for. We know this number is used for different types of financial aid programming, some scholarships even. So we know how important this number is for the students and the families we support. So what is the SAI? This is an old term that we used to use back in the day. I feel like I'm showing my age because I feel like when I first started the work, we used SAI. We didn't use EFC. So they're going back to this term. Student aid index is used to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. There has been a change in this formula that will increase the number of students who are eligible for the Pell Grant, which is great. And the new SAI formula will result in a negative, can result in a student receiving a negative SAI. As I mentioned earlier, the minimum SAI is negative 1,500. So just so we can compare the differences, the EFC in the past used to consider household size reported by the student, the number of folks who are in college in the household could impact the EFC. Businesses and farms of fewer than 100 folks employed were not counted as an asset and not included in that EFC number, and the lowest EFC available was 0. Beginning the 2024-2025 FAFSA, we're now using the SAI, where they calculate the family size and not the household size. Just as a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, the family size is associated with the contributor and not necessarily with the student. So that's why they changed the language from household size to family size, because it could be a contributor that does not share residence with the student. And that family would be the family that lives with the contributor, not necessarily the family that lives with the student. The number in college will no longer be considered on the SAI. They are including the net value of any businesses and family farms in the in asset reporting. And the lowest SAI is negative 1,500, but it will be treated as 0 for grant awarding purposes. So it will be treated as 0 in calculating the Pell Grant. They won't get more because they have students who have a negative SAI won't qualify for more Pell Grant than what the maximum amount is for that year. That number just informs how they make other financial aid determinations as it relates to federal and state financial aid. So FAFSA submission, after a student has done their FAFSA and they've sent invitations to their parents to do their section. As we saw at the end, we saw what that screen looks like for the student, but the student will receive a FAFSA submission summary with their SAI within 1 to 3 business days. We know that there is a delay right now, and students are not getting this information between 1 to 3 business days. Schools, based on federal student aid, schools will start to receive calculations with the ICER beginning of February. And so at that point, they will make decisions about financial aid statements, and students will start to get SAIs back. We do know some do have SAIs, but the majority of the students that I've supported since the FAFSA rolled out on New Year's Eve have not been awarded SAIs yet. If a student starts the FAFSA, an incomplete FAFSA can stay in the federal student aid system for 45 days before it is deleted. To restart the clock, though, the student just needs to log back into the FAFSA application. Their parent can log into it to restart the clock. So it's not 45 days, they need to submit it after 45 days. No, it's actually 45 days that it stays active with no activity before it's deleted. So the student can log back in at any time. Also, FSA will automatically resend contributor information after 7 or 14 days of no action from the contributor. So just kind of as a reminder for them to log in and do their particular section of the application. FAFSA corrections cannot be made until FAFSAs have been processed. I know there are quite a few students who made a mistake. Some mistakes were innocent, others, they just realized we want to add more schools to our college list. No one is able to make any changes until their FAFSA has been processed. So they just have to play the waiting game and wait for it to be processed to log back in to make any changes. But just also as a reminder, students can't make changes to the financial section just by logging into federal student aid. They have to work directly with their school's financial aid office if they need to make changes to the actual financials section. I've worked with a couple of families who realized that they forgot to report certain asset information, or even the question about the National Free and Reduced Lunch question. Can't make changes until the FAFSA has been processed. So students can either wait for that processing to happen, or they can reach out to the colleges they've been accepted to already and acknowledge that, hey, I made an error on my FAFSA. If you start to process before, if they start to make financial aid decisions before they're able to make the changes, this is the change that I need to make. I think it's appropriate to send that email to say, these are the changes that I need to make that could affect how the school is awarding financial aid. All right, suggestions for supporting families. This is not a comprehensive list of all the suggestions. I'm sure more are going to come out as we move through the FAFSA Q&A section, but just kind of general things. Because we know that there's a delay in verifying information for the FSA ID, we encourage those who are hosting FAFSA events to give families a heads up, I think at least 2 weeks in advance, to encourage them to start getting those FSA IDs created. Kudos to all the schools who had FSA ID creation nights in the fall to kind of get that ball rolling. Most of those parents by now, their information has been verified and they're able to use their FSA IDs as soon as they log in. But encourage them to create their FSA IDs as soon as possible so that it can be verified in time for your FAFSA events. Also, because of guidance that we now have from federal student aid about how to answer the National School Lunch Program question, I think it's wise to keep a copy of those poverty guidelines available with you. I've been taking copies with me to different schools when I'm participating in FAFSA events to have it available. I am laminating a copy of this as well because we use it so often, but it may be helpful to have a copy available to make sure students are eligible for the National Free and Reduced Lunch Program before they check that box. Because as I mentioned in the email last week, if they check that box because everyone in their school qualifies, but their income is higher than 60K, they won't be able to answer the asset question. And that question is required for families whose income is, that section is required for families whose income is higher than 60K. So if you've had families that check that box based on the fact that everyone in the school gets free lunch, as opposed to checking that box based on income, they will have to make changes to their financial section. So they may want to give a heads up to the colleges if they're not able to do that soon. Next, those who are having the FSA mismatch issue, meaning, and we really try to keep kids from guessing birthdays of their parents and guessing social security numbers and things of that sort when they create their own FSA ID, or even when they complete their section of the FAFSA. In the past, they've been able to contact federal student aid directly to say like, hey, I put in the wrong birthday, or I put in the wrong social security number. They're able to make those changes so it can be verified through federal student aid. But now, due to the delays in the FAFSA, it's taking weeks to rectify changes with the actual FSA ID mismatch. If you're working with families who have this particular problem, it may be easier for them to just use the paper FAFSA and wait until later in the year when FSA has less traffic to be able to work on rectifying those issues directly with them. Submitting a paper FAFSA, they're still going to provide consent from their information to be pulled from the IRS, but it gets the application done. They're not in a holding pattern waiting for federal student aid to have someone available to be able to help them with this situation. But the moral of this story is tell students if they don't have the official birthday and social security number, addresses, if they do not have this official information, do not attempt to just guess and put information down, because it creates even longer delays than what's intended. I'm sure the student just wants to get through the application, but the information is wrong, it creates a delay. Next, if families encounter unusual FAFSA error messages, and we know what unusual looks like. They have the information in, and one of the ones that's coming up more often is the question, the pop-up saying this person may have an FSA ID or studentaid.gov account. If you get that pop-up and they won't let you move beyond the screen, that is an error. And so there are many errors that folks are encountering and moving through the application. And I call them unusual because for us, we may say that does not even make sense. Why can't I move past this screen? What's going on with this information? If they're getting those unusual FAFSA errors and they need to contact FSA, just give them a heads up about the delays. Some parents don't anticipate the delays. Some have been on hold for 4 hours and have been able to talk to someone. Others have been on hold for 4 hours and get a recording saying that folks are not available, call back at another time. Give families a heads up so that they can prepare for that and they won't get discouraged by the process. As I mentioned earlier, I'll provide a link to the FAFSA Issues Alert webpage so that you can watch and see what are some of the more common challenges that folks are having with the FAFSA throughout the country, and also keep up with the changes that federal student aid are making or the ways that they're working through those problems. They let you know when they've resolved the issue. So it's an important website to kind of watch because it lets you know about the status updates. Lastly, and I can't understate the importance of this, the paper FAFSA is still available. Under normal circumstances, I would not encourage dependent U.S. citizens to use the paper FAFSA because the processing time is long. But due to the already delayed, the delays we're already having with the FAFSA, I think the paper FAFSA is a safe option for getting the information done and getting the application done, submitting it to federal student aid. But the advice I would give around using the paper FAFSA is after they've sent it to federal student aid, and be sure that they've signed it because it needs to have a wet signature, they should scan it and email it to their financial aid offices where they have been offered admissions to let them know that they've submitted a paper copy. It may take a minute to process, but here is the application we submitted. And it gives them kind of some information to start to work with because it's going to be a delay in processing the paper FAFSA in general. Wow, we got to the contact us screen very quickly. So I'm gonna jump into the Q&A. If anyone have questions on this information, these are all the relevant changes that make sense for the work that we do. And again, if there are any questions about it, I'd be happy to answer. We do have the FAFSA Q&A that's coming up at the 2 o'clock hour. So I will be answering the unanswered questions from previously in the talk that folks submitted in their registration, and any other questions that may come up that are not necessarily related to the specifics of this talk I just gave. So I'm going into the Q&A. Okay, what if the students' parents are getting the error that their phone number or email address is in use? So if families are getting a message that the phone number or email address is in use, they can work directly with federal student aid to change that. Again, they have to work directly with federal student aid. Unless they have another email address or they have another phone number that they can use, which is what I actually encourage. If they have an alternate email address or phone number, use that, it's easier. But we recognize that some people just reuse phone numbers, or some service providers reuse phone numbers. So they can work directly with federal student aid to make those changes. But again, if they have a hard time getting in touch with federal student aid, I would say complete the paper FAFSA and then circle back to FSA later. I have found that sometimes they never get the email saying they're verified, but if I log in, it shows that they are there. Yes, Amy, that's certainly what's happening. Some families are not getting the email saying they're verified. So I've been telling them to just keep checking, keep logging in to the studentaid.gov website to see once SSA has verified their ID so they can use the FSA ID. Next, number of children in college. Can they be a special circumstance? No, number of children in college is not considered a special circumstance. It's just no longer considered as a part of the FAFSA calculations. I've heard a couple practitioners advise families to reach out directly to their school's financial aid office and ask for their financial aid to be reconsidered based on the fact that they're having multiple folks in the family, multiple children in college. So that's always an option. Again, the school may not take that into consideration at all, but I think it doesn't hurt to ask. Sorry, it was not clear at all. When Tamika says many students are not receiving an SAI, is that equivalent to SAI not being calculated? Yes, yes. When I say that many students are not receiving an SAI, that means they have not gotten one yet because it has not been calculated by federal student aid. There has been delays upon delays in creating FSA IDs, verifying ID, getting an actual SAI after the FAFSA had been processed. Well, because there's a delay in that pipeline, no, many students have not been awarded an SAI yet, or have not been, their SAI has not been calculated yet. All right, if a student, is this a question I'm reading? If a youth has created a FAFSA ID before, do they have to keep the same? I already answered that one. I don't see any more questions. Oh,
we have two questions, Tamika.
I'm sorry. Yes, Angela.
I can help with two questions. One, the audience is asking if this PowerPoint and recording will be shared with them. I assume we know that answer, but I wanted you to share it out loud.
Yes, the PowerPoint and the recording will be shared. I'm going to email it out to everyone who registered. And then, of course, the recordings are going to be posted on our YouTube page for you to review. And everyone, that's Angela Greenlay, our national team lead, who's helping me out. I appreciate her support.
And I have another question that I answered, but I wanted to just verify if you've seen this situation. We have an audience member who says that a student created an FSA ID and was able to complete the FAFSA the same day, and they didn't have any issues. I thought this was a surprise, and I said, that's great, but they wanted to confirm that that doesn't mean that there's actually a hidden issue they're not aware of.
No, this happens. It happens, and we often throw parties at FAFSA nights when it happens. Yes, it certainly happens. Only thing I would be sure is to make sure they did the 2024-2025 FAFSA versus the 2023-2024 FAFSA. At a couple of FAFSA nights, I kind of walked up and I only noticed that it was the wrong FAFSA because of certain questions that were asked. There was a question about work study, which is no longer on the FAFSA. And I go, I don't think this is this year's application. So that's the only consideration I would take. I would make sure that they completed the right FAFSA. But yes, it is happening. Students have been able to students and parents create FSA IDs, move through it, hit submission, and they're done. Yes, it has happened. I have a student whose parents are married and live together. Her mom has completed her FSA ID, but she is unable to sign a submit because the father can't create an FSA ID with his I-10. Would it be best to submit the paper FAFSA? So the first question I would ask is the parent's filing status. Be sure that it's married filed separated before we go down the rabbit hole with the other FSA ID. Be sure that their filing status is married filed separated, or they filed two separate 1040s or whatever it was. But if they filed married filed jointly, only that one parent needs to create an FSA ID, and only that one parent needs to complete their part of the FAFSA. If though they filed married, filed separated, that other parent cannot create an FSA ID using their I-10. they can only check that I do not have a social security number box under the social security number entry field. And then it will take them through the knowledge-based verification process. If they can't, if their answers do not match with the information in federal student aid pulled from the credit bureau, then the next step will be working directly with federal student aid. If though they can't get through that knowledge-based verification process, I would then encourage them to complete a paper FAFSA and then loop back with federal student aid later on in the season. Next, the only SAIs my students have immediately received upon submission are those who get a negative 1,500. Anyone else receiving a different SAI? Lisa, that is the only SAI I'm seeing too. I'm only seeing the SAI from folks who are not required to report asset information. And then even to that degree, I'm only seeing the negative 1,500 SAI as well. So no, I'm not seeing a different one. And I think probably because this one is kind of automatic for based on certain responses. But some students are getting that SAI, some are getting none at all. All right, next, I spoke to a parent over the phone and they said that their child submitted the FAFSA, but the parent has issues on their end. What advice do you have when helping families over the phone or email if you can't physically see the problem they're talking about? I would advise them to see, if you can't see the problem, it's hard to be able to help them troubleshoot. What I do is host families via Zoom. We all know, well, I won't say we all know, but many of you know that I host FAFSA Fridays to be able to share the screen with families and help them complete the FAFSA or answer any questions that they may have. Another way could be that they can send you a screenshot of whatever error message they get or whatever challenge they're having. But it's going to be hard to be, because we're not as used to seeing this application as we're used to seeing the other one. So it's going to be hard to provide advice or guidance for a space, for an application or a screen that you can't see. So I would try to coordinate an opportunity to sit down with the family or support them virtually where you can see the screen to make sure that everything is, all the answers are correct, and that they may be receiving an error message that's just unusual, like I mentioned earlier. That is, unfortunately, that's happening pretty regularly. Parents for sure are receiving a lot of error messages. And in those cases, we've been recommending the paper FAFSA. Since there's not a work study question, what is the next step students need to take? Should they contact the financial aid office? No, Ms. White, and good to see you. No, if they removed the work study question because they're considering everyone for work study. Everyone who completes the FAFSA is being considered for a federal work study program. So if the school decides to award it, it'll show up on the student's financial aid statement, and they'll then decide whether or not they want to accept the award or not. But yeah, they removed the question because they're considering everyone for work study now. And so she's seen different SAIs. Great, I have not. I've only seen negative 1,500. Okay, someone's saying the process for parents without social security numbers is not working quite yet. Any suggestions? Yes, I've given the suggestion of using the paper FAFSA. That's the only suggestion we have, because those have to, parents without social security numbers who don't pass the knowledge-based verification process have to go directly through federal student aid to go through the ID proofing process. If they're not able to access federal student aid, and we're even, the messaging we're giving now from federal student aid, if you call, is that parents without social security numbers are not being awarded, are not being able to create an FSA ID right now. They're working through the challenges. But if the goal is to complete the FAFSA and it's time sensitive and you realize that the family's like, what's going on? I would lean into the paper FAFSA. Do you know if a student's parents changing their mind about submitting the tax reform? Yes, how did that? Oh, we already answered that. Have we answered all the questions?
Yeah, we are out of questions. We've gotten them all answered. Great job.
Great. Thanks, Angela, for your help. All right, so let's take a 5-minute break to give me a minute to reset and get ready for FAFSA Q&A. This will be fun. See y'all shortly. So we'll connect again at 2:02.